A few weeks ago, I packed my bags and traveled across some of the most important battlefields and memorials of the Second World War. I walked the beaches of Normandy, stood beneath the rows of crosses overlooking Omaha Beach, wandered through the streets of Sainte-Mère-Église, and followed the story of D-Day through the places where it actually happened. From there, I made my way into Belgium, through the forests around Bastogne, where young American soldiers endured freezing temperatures and constant shelling during the Battle of the Bulge. And finally, I crossed into Germany, ending my journey at the Eagle's Nest, a place forever connected to one of history's darkest chapters. Before this trip, I thought I understood World War II. I'd read the books, I'd watched the documentaries, I'd seen the movies. I knew the dates, I knew the battles, I knew who won and who had lost. But standing in these places changed something. The beaches were quieter than I expected. The distances between famous battles were smaller. The cemeteries were larger. And the war itself felt less like a collection of historical events and more like millions of ordinary people forced into extraordinary circumstances. These weren't just places I'd seen in photographs or read about in textbooks anymore. They became real. So in this video, I want to share some of the things that surprised me most while touring World War II sites across France, Belgium, and Germany. Lessons that gave me a new perspective on a conflict we often think we already understand. Because sometimes the most powerful thing history can teach us isn't found in a classroom. Sometimes it's found by standing where it happened. When people think of Normandy, they usually think of D-Day. They think of landing craft, machine gun fire, and scenes from movies like Saving Private Ryan. I was no different. Before visiting, I had years of build-up images in my mind of June 6, 1944. But when I finally stood there myself, the reality was very different from what I expected. The first thing that struck me was how quiet everything felt. Not empty, not abandoned, just quiet. The sound I remember most wasn't gunfire from a reenactment or tour guides explaining history. It was the sound of waves. People were walking along the shoreline. Families were enjoying the beach. Some people were swimming. Others were sitting in the sand and enjoying the weather. And to be clear, that's exactly what these beaches should be today. They aren't military sites anymore, they're living parts of France. But there was something surreal about watching ordinary life unfold in a place so closely tied to extraordinary events. Standing there, it was impossible not to think about what happened on those same beaches 80 years ago. The water looks peaceful, the weather was beautiful, and yet I know that thousands of young men had crossed that same stretch of water under conditions that are difficult to imagine. That contrast stayed with me. Life and history existing in the same place at the same time. The second thing that surprised me was the size of the beaches themselves. I knew Omaha Beach was large. I knew the Allies had crossed significant distances under fire, but I don't think I truly understood the scale until I stood there. Movies compress distance, photographs flatten terrain. When you're standing at the waterline and looking inland, suddenly the battlefield makes so much more sense. You realize how exposed these soldiers were. You realize how far they had to travel, and you realize how difficult the operation actually was. At several points during my visit, I found myself simply stopping and looking from the water towards the bluffs, looking from the bluffs back towards the sea, trying to imagine landing craft appearing on the horizon, trying to imagine the noise, trying to imagine the confusion, trying to imagine what it would have felt like to step off a boat knowing exactly what was waiting ahead. No documentary had ever given me that perspective. Being physically present did. The third thing that stood out was how much the history remains visible. When people think of battlefields, they often imagine a single monument and a visitor center. Normandy is different. History is absolutely everywhere. You'll find memorials on the beaches, plaques in small towns, markers on roadsides, statues, museums, preserved bunkers, cemeteries, and monuments dedicated to individual units. Some are large and impossible to miss. Others are small enough that you could drive right past them if you weren't paying attention. But together they create a feeling that the region has never forgotten what happened there. The war isn't hidden away in a museum. It's woven directly into the landscape. And honestly, I wasn't prepared for just how much there was to see. Beyond the American beaches, there are countless other sites that tell the D-Day story. At Gold Beach, the remains of the Mulberry Harbor still sit offshore, a reminder of the massive artificial port that helped supply the Allied advance. At Juno Beach, you can see where Canadian forces fought their way inland, while Sword Beach marks the eastern edge of the invasion, where British troops came ashore. In Sainte-Mère-Église, The church still displays the famous paratrooper hanging from its steeple, commemorating one of the most recognizable moments of the airborne landings. Just a short drive away is Pegasus Bridge, where British airborne troops captured a critical crossing in the opening minutes of D-Day, and those are only a handful of the places worth visiting. Everywhere you turn, there's another battlefield, memorial, museum, or monument with its own story to tell. Crossing from France into Belgium, our major stop was Bastogne. Today, Bastogne is a peaceful town. People sit at cafes, traffic moves through the streets, and life feels completely normal. If you didn't know the history, you might not realize that one of the most famous battles of World War II was fought right here. What surprised me most wasn't the military history, it was the destruction. Before visiting, I knew Bastogne had been surrounded during the Battle of the Bulge. What I didn't fully appreciate was how heavily the town had been bombed and shelled. During the battle, Bastogne sat at a critical crossroads, making it a key objective for the German offensive, similar to the Battle of Gettysburg during the American Civil War. As fighting intensified, artillery and bombs pounded the town. Entire blocks were damaged or destroyed. Homes, businesses, and public buildings were caught in the fighting. Civilians found themselves trapped in the middle of one of the largest battles fought by American forces during World War II. One story that really stood out to me was that of Belgian nurse Renee Lemaire. She volunteered to care for wounded American soldiers in Bastogne, and she was killed when the aid station where she worked was struck during the battle. Standing in the town today, it's really hard to imagine that level of destruction and suffering. What makes Bastogne so fascinating is just how much there is to learn there. While the carnage there isn't at the forefront like it is in Normandy, Bastogne is like a closed book waiting to be read. What helps you understand the scale of the battle are the museums throughout Bastogne. The Bastogne War Museum does an incredible job of showing just how devastating the fighting and bombing were. Seeing artifacts recovered from the battlefield and damaged items from the town puts the destruction into perspective. It's one thing to read that Bastogne was heavily bombed. It's another to stand a few feet away from objects that survived it. Another highlight was the 101st Airborne Museum. Unlike the larger Bastogne War Museum, this one feels much more personal and immersive. Life-sized wax figures recreate scenes from the battle, helping visitors visualize what soldiers experienced during those desperate weeks in December 1944. The most memorable part for me, though, was the bombing simulator in the basement. Visitors are taken into a replica cellar, similar to the shelters civilians used during the Battle of the Bulge. As the simulation begins, the room erupts with the sound of artillery shells, bombs, machine gun fire, and tanks rumbling overhead. The noise is deafening. Every explosion rattles the walls, and when a tank passes by, the entire room shakes. For a few minutes, it feels like less of a museum exhibit and more like being trapped beneath a battlefield. Sitting there, surrounded by the constant thunder of explosions, you begin to understand why so many veterans describe combat as hell on earth. The simulation can't recreate the fear of knowing a shell could actually hit you, but it does give you a glimpse of just how overwhelming and terrifying the bombing of Bastogne must have been. The museums don't stop with the Bastogne War Museum or the 101st Airborne Museum. Throughout Bastogne, it feels like there's another museum, memorial, or historical site around every corner. But what makes Bastogne unique is that you don't need to step inside a museum to find reminders of the battle. And eventually, those reminders lead you into the forests surrounding the town. The forests are beautiful today. They're quiet, green, and peaceful. But almost immediately, you begin finding reminders of the war. And then there were the foxholes. Standing next to a foxhole in the middle of the forest is a completely different experience than seeing one in a photograph. Many are still clearly visible nearly 80 years later. And while some are reconstructed and not original, looking at them, it isn't hard to imagine exhausted soldiers digging into the frozen ground and trying to survive one of the harshest winters of the war. That was another thing I didn't fully understand before visiting: the weather. When I was there, the forests were comfortable and peaceful, but in December 1944, these same woods were covered in snow and ice. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures, deep snow, and constant exposure while fighting a desperate battle here. You don't just learn about the Battle of the Bulge here, you walk through it. Crossing into Germany felt different. In France and Belgium, the war seemed to be everywhere. You could walk through a forest and stumble across foxholes, visit a town square and find a tank on display, or stand on a beach where one of the most important battles in history unfolded. Germany felt quieter at first, but the history was still there. It just carried a different weight. One of the most powerful places we visited was Dachau. Like many people, I had learned about concentration camps in school, seen photographs, and watched documentaries, but none of that prepares you for actually walking through one. The first thing that struck me was the silence. Hundreds of visitors were there that day, yet the grounds felt almost unnaturally quiet. People spoke in whispers, most just looked around and took it in. The scale is also difficult to appreciate until you're standing there. The camp stretches much further than it appears in photographs. Walking through the grounds, past the barracks area, guard towers, and memorials, you begin to understand that this wasn't just a place mentioned in a history book. It was a functioning system designed to dehumanize thousands of people. The infirmary was one of the areas that stayed with me the most. Looking at those buildings and learning what happened there made the history feel incredibly personal. It's one thing to hear statistics, it's another to stand in the places where real people suffered and realize that every number represented somebody's son, daughter, husband, wife, or friend. What I found admirable was how Germany chooses to confront this history. They don't hide it. They don't pretend like it didn't happen. Students learn about it in school. Sites like Dachau are preserved, and there's a clear effort to make sure future generations understand exactly what occurred. That's not always easy for a country to do. Many nations prefer to focus on their victories and accomplishments. Germany has chosen to preserve some of its darkest chapters as a warning, and I think there is something important about that. Later, we traveled south into the Bavarian Alps to visit the Eagle's Nest. If Dachau represented the horrors of the Nazi regime, the Eagle's Nest represented its power at its peak. The drive up the mountain is spectacular, and when you finally reach the summit, the view is almost impossible to describe. Mountain ranges stretch to the horizon in every direction. Looking out across the Alps, it is easy to understand why this location became one of the most famous sites associated with Hitler's inner circle. But what fascinated me the most wasn't the view. It was the reminder of what happened after the war ended. Throughout the building, there are still carvings and inscriptions left behind by Allied troops who captured and occupied the site in 1945. Some soldiers scratched their names into the stone and wood, leaving behind small pieces of evidence that they had been there. Standing in these rooms, you can almost imagine the young American soldiers exploring the building after Germany's surrender, realizing they were walking through one of the most symbolic locations of the Nazi regime. That's what made the Eagle's Nest so memorable to me. It's easy to think of it as just another historical building with an incredible view. But when you notice those carvings and begin to think about the men who left them behind, the site transforms from a tourist destination into a place where history feels tangible. Germany left me with a different perspective than France or Belgium did. In Normandy and Bastogne, I often found myself thinking about the battles. In Germany, I found myself thinking about the consequences. Visiting places like Dachau and the Eagle's Nest wasn't just about seeing where history happened, it was about understanding how a nation remembers some of the darkest and most consequential events of the 20th century. As I look back and reflect on this journey through France, Belgium, and Germany, one thing stands out above all else. It's impossible to truly understand the scale of history until you stand where it happened. You can read about D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, or the Second World War in books. You can watch documentaries and study maps. But standing on those beaches, walking through those forests, and visiting places like Dachau gives those events a weight that is difficult to put into words. What struck me most was how close the past still feels. In Bastogne, foxholes remain hidden among the trees. Along the Normandy coast, monuments stand watch over beaches that once saw unimaginable violence. Even in Germany, reminders of the war can still be found if you know where to look. These places are more than tourist destinations. They are reminders of the people who lived through these events, the sacrifices they made, and the lessons they left behind. History isn't just something that happened, it's something that continues to shape the world around us today. And there may be no better place to reflect on that than here, among the rows of white crosses at the Normandy American Cemetery, a place that reminds us not only of what we lost, but of what was fought for.